Welcome to Air in Review series by Asian Council of Science Editors, and where we will be exploring the most significant developments in scholarly publishing during 2024. And today we are honored to be joined by Laura Dormer, Editorial Director at Becaris Publishing, with us to unpack the fascinating evolution of research metrics. Our focus of today's episode is Metrics Review, redefining impact through metrics and altmetrics, and we will be talking about how traditional and alternative metrics are reshaping the research impact, how it's assessed and evaluated. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
To start us off, how would you describe the evolution of research metrics this year? What are the key developments have stood out to you in both traditional metrics like impact factor and citation count, and the emerging ones like altmetrics?
Absolutely. So I think there has been continuing discussion this year. So I think it's been going on for the last few years, but has continued this year on the benefits, but I think also the limitations of the different types of metric and how those can be used responsibly. And I spoke, as you know, on this topic back in August at the Asian Council of Science Editor Annual Meeting. And I think it was really interesting to talk there about some of the initiatives from this year and recent years that have been started up to supplement those traditional metrics you mentioned, like citation counting, with other types of indicator of impact. And I think the discussions around that have continued this year.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for providing a fascinating overview and start. So from your perspective as editorial director at Becaris Publishing, how have the discussions and attitude around research impact assessment shifted recently? And are there any emerging trends or challenges that you have noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we've said, the discussion this year around assessing impact has really kind of expanded. I think we've spoken this year about assessing the impact of all the different types of research output. So starting to think more beyond the traditional journal article and thinking about broader output. So maybe things like preprints, but also thinking about open science practices and how researchers that are kind of embracing these open practices can be recognized for doing that. So things like sharing of data sets and those kind of things, seeing that being reused in future research and thinking about how that can be recognized as a research impact assessment. I think there's been more discussion as well this year, thinking about more qualitative assessments. So obviously the metrics that we are familiar with, the impact factor and altmetrics as well, are quantitative in nature. And I think it's important to think more holistically, think around all the different types of assessment impacts. And I think it's important as well for publishers and editors to support that responsible use and interpretation by providing a broad range of metrics on their journals in a transparent way.
Exactly. So building on that, traditional metrics like impact factor and citation counts, they have been considered as basic pillars for research assessment for decades. So how have you observed any changes in how these metrics are being used or valued, or do they remain largely the same in the terms of their relevance and application?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there has been some changes. I think on the side of the metric providers, there's been some nuances and changes and updates in how some of these metrics are calculated. So the impact factor, for example, has been updated in various ways recently. So they now use online publication date as the point at which a publication is considered to have been published, rather than sort of journal issue dates. So moving from thinking in that kind of print journal mindset to a more digital way of working. And that includes as well using early access content as part of the calculation, which it hadn't done previously. The journal citation report itself, which is the report that comes out annually that includes the impact factor calculations, has changed a bit in recent years. So it's been expanded to include more journals. So they've introduced journals from their emerging sources citation index and really kind of expanded that pool of content that's being drawn on to create the impact factors. Introducing additional metrics, so things like the journal citation indicator, which allows more cross-discipline comparison of journal performance. But I mean, I think, there's always going to be these sort of nuances and updates and so on and so forth. But I think overall, citation metrics probably remain largely the same in terms of what they are, how we understand them, and what they can tell us.
Exactly, interesting point. So let's talk about the influence of traditional metrics. How do they continue to shape the critical decisions in publishing and funding allocations and academic career progression? Are they still the gold standard or they are facing some challenges?
I think the traditional metrics do still play a large role. I think particularly in academic decisions, so things you mentioned there sort of around hiring and tenure decisions and grant funding allocation. And I think as well from the publisher's perspective, journals do still gain prestige via the impact factor. This is something that I think has been hard to break away from, although there has been continuing efforts to do so. We've got things like the DORA initiative, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment, that came out, I think, around about 2012, I think, but has really sort of continued over the years to push for responsible use of these kind of metrics. And even this year, they put out, I think, in June time, a guidance on responsible use of quantitative indicators in research assessment. So I think we do still rely on those traditional metrics, even though there are these efforts now, I think, to try and pull away. They are still sort of holding quite a lot of power still.
Exactly. So speaking of challenges, Altmetrics have gained traction for providing a broader view of research impacts, but they have also faced a great criticism. So especially for being overly reliant on social media or vulnerable to manipulation. So how do you think that the research community can address these concerns?
I think it is useful for the research community to be as familiar as possible, really, with how these metrics are calculated, and making sure that students and early career researchers as well are familiar with this. So, for example, the Altmetrics score, so Altmetric with the capital A, is given as a sort of an overall number, an overall score, and that pulls in many different sources. So social media, as you mentioned, but also lots of other sources. So things like guidelines documents, policy documents, patent information, that sort of thing. But the different sources are given a different weighting to create that overall number. And I think knowing that and knowing some of the nuances behind that helps you look beyond that total number and think more about how to use that information effectively. These scores and indicators take into account all types of mentions, and I think they might be positive, but they might also be negative. So thinking about that, I think, is important. Just having a social media mention isn't in itself a good or a bad thing. You need to look at the context around these things, and I think as well, thinking within that kind of light, and also thinking about how these numbers change over time. So by sort of the nature of what they are, social media mentions are the sorts of things that will happen almost immediately after a piece of research is published. Even the same day, people will be sharing and talking about content, whereas the other types of sources take some time, sometimes years even, to build up over time. So it's not just about looking at a one-time snapshot of an altmetric score, but looking at how this builds over time is very important as well. And knowing all these different nuances is important to make sure that they're being used appropriately, and I think hopefully then address some of the criticism, because if you're using it in an appropriate way, then that helps negate some of that, I think.
These are some more important considerations. So what steps do you think should be taken to ensure that the Altmetrics provide a more accurate and meaningful representation of research impact? Are there any specific innovation or practices that stand out to you?
I mean, I think transparency is really important. So having a clear understanding of where the numbers come from, what data they're based on, how the weightings are allocated. I think it's important for any altmetric provider to be transparent about that, so that then when people come to use those numbers, they can be confident that they're using them appropriately. It's important that they include a broad range of sources. If new sources come to the fore, different social media platforms, say, or all sorts of different things, it's important that those services continue updated to pull in those different sources. And I think as well, it's important to have collaboration between the different stakeholders that are using the metrics, so that the providers and the people using them know what they want of each other and what they can expect from each other, so that they can answer the questions that they have.
Exactly. So foreseeing the future, how do you see that research impact assessment evolving in the coming years? Do you think that Altmetrics will gain more prominence, or will the traditional metrics continue to dominate the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, there is and there has been a lot of discussion on why traditional metrics shouldn't be used in isolation, and how metrics in general should be used responsibly. But I think there's still reliance on these, particularly the impact factors we've discussed. And I think there needs to be continuing efforts on that. But I mean, ultimately, I think, or at least I hope, that there will be sort of a hybrid situation, I guess, of traditional and altmetrics, bringing in quantitative but also qualitative measures of impact to give a more rounded picture. And I'm sure, as we know, any discussion about publishing at the moment at some point or other touches on artificial intelligence. And I'm sure there'll be AI-based tools will be playing a role in this to maybe pull in a broader range of sources and I guess help with sort of transparency around the methodology of their creation as well. I think overall, hopefully, there will be improved transparency in general and help capture these broader dimensions of impact. I think, the reason that the impact factor has held sway for such a long time is because it is quite, it's a simple number. It's quite easy to understand. People know what it means. Whereas when you're thinking more big picture, we're thinking holistically, that is just a more complicated conversation to have. It's not as easy to make use of that information in quite such a direct way. And that's, I think, why impact factors and citation metrics and traditional metrics in general continue to be popular. But I think, with continuing efforts, I think we can start to shift away. And I think we already are starting to shift in the conversation around that.
Yes, and on a related note, interdisciplinary and global collaboration, they are becoming increasingly important in research. So how do you think that these partnerships will influence the development of applications of research metrics, and will they help us move towards a more inclusive or comprehensive systems?
Yeah, definitely. I really hope so. I mean, I think it's so important, as you've mentioned, to engage all those different relevant stakeholders, whether that's across disciplines. There's a lot of multidisciplinary research that goes on, obviously, but also thinking globally as well, to make sure that metrics are addressing all the different priorities of these different stakeholders and different stakeholders. Whether they are the researchers themselves, whether they are the funding bodies, the academic institutions, the journals, the publishers themselves, we all have slightly different questions around what we're asking of these metrics and what use we're putting those to. And the people that are creating those metrics need to be aware of that and having conversations with all those different stakeholders to make sure that they are addressing those needs, but also making it clear and transparent about whether or not these metrics are suitable ones for answering the different questions that are being asked. So just general dialogue, and I think in conversation between everybody will be really important.
Exactly. So finally, before we wrap up, how can we ensure that both traditional and alternative metrics, they are used ethically and transparently, and what steps can be taken to promote a fairer assessment of research impact in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is so important. I think for ethical and transparent use of metrics, you really need to make sure there is good understanding on their application. And that includes, I think, and probably most importantly, includes their limitations. So we all know no one metric is perfect. Nothing tells you everything about a piece of research. And I don't think, we shouldn't be striving to find one perfect metric. It's about thinking, things like the DORA initiative, I think will be really important. I think continuing to think broadly about all the different types of information we can gather about the impact that research is having on the public good, ultimately, using metrics alongside more narrative context, I think will be really important to prevent any misuse or misinterpretation of that information.
Exactly. So having altmetric and metrics in the same frame, how do you see the cushion of education, awareness, and training aspect being your experience working in publishing and editorial side? So how do you see with having AI and altmetrics and new terminologies to the system, how we have to build for awareness and education side training for researchers, funding institutes, and the related dots?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a really important role that publishers can play. Obviously, we are probably the most familiar of anybody with the journals that we're producing. We keep very careful track of the different metrics that are provided on our journals, but also we are the owners and the creators of metrics as well. We have a lot of information that we get from our websites and so forth about the number of people that are reading our content, where they're coming from, parts of the world or different, different types of people reading the content. This is information that we have control over and we can provide to our readers and our researchers. And I think we have a role to, an important role to play in educating around what the different metrics are, making sure that we're transparent and not just cherry picking, but providing a broad range of metrics about our content. But I do think as well, there's an important role in academia as well for the education of these, the students, the up and coming researchers, the early career researchers, to make sure that they're and whether they get that information from us as publishers or their senior mentors and so forth. It's important that they do have access to that kind of information. And I think everything moves so quickly. With AI, where we are now compared to the beginning of this year, there's been all sorts of developments and discussions, and I'm sure everything around metrics as well. These things continue to have changes and nuances all the time, and I think it's important for us all to take responsibility, I guess, as editors and publishers, but academics and researchers as well, to keep ourselves up to date and informed so that we are using that information appropriately and not misinterpreting anything that's being put out there. So yeah, it's an ongoing education for all of us, I think.
Exactly. Thank you, Laura, for sharing your valuable insights on the evolving landscape of research metrics, its key trends and challenges for 2024. And it's been a pleasure hearing your thoughts, and we're excited to see how these discussions will shape the future of scholarly publishing in 2025. So once again, thank you for being a part of this exclusive Aired in Review series by Asian Council of Science Editor, and it's been an absolute privilege to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.